So welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is being presented by a dear friend and partner of the LFGO, Lisa Merkel-Holguin. Lisa is Associate Professor at the Department of Pediatrics, Child Abuse and Neglect, based in the internationally renowned Kempe Center, School of Medicine, University of Colorado. I've known Lisa for 4 years, but this is the first time we've met in person, so it's a very, very special day for me. Now, I'm going to share a small portion of Lisa's biography. I say small because her record of leading change and innovation and impacting child welfare and child protection systems is extensive, not only in the US, but internationally. She has over 25 years of experience in identifying, developing, and implementing innovative reforms into child welfare systems, particularly in the areas of child safety and permanency. As a principal investigator and senior research analyst, she has been involved with numerous child welfare evaluations. She has also managed numerous multi-year and short-term projects that have targeted improving foster care and permanency planning efforts. Lisa is regarded as playing an integral and leading role in two major reforms that the US child welfare system have adopted on great scale: family group decision-making and differential response. She is now leading a third wave, something called the Together in Truth project. And this is the work that she will talk to us about today. On the Kempe website, it states that this project is guided by a shared vision of truth, justice, and empowerment, that it is embarking on a creative journey to reimagine the landscape of the US child welfare system. The Kempe Center says about itself that it ensures integration of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in all areas of its work by way of discovery, leadership, action, accountability, evaluation, and transformation. And in this work, they aim to strengthen families, communities, and the systems that serve them. They're committed to the belief that abuse and neglect are preventable and that people are resilient. They say they are curious, they take a stand, and they test out assumptions. How, and if the Kempe is achieving this, is something we'll hear now from Lisa in this talk entitled Truth Telling in Child Welfare, Quest for Justice. So without further ado, we're going to hand over to Lisa.
Thank you, Beverly. It's lovely to be here with all of you, and thank you for that generous introduction. You can see the title of the talk is Truth Telling in Child Welfare, or Transformative Change in Child Welfare. We see truth-telling as the possibility to get to our quest for justice. Transformative change appears to be an elusive quest for justice. And so here we go. Just a quick nod to my partners in this work, Kevin Campbell and Elizabeth Wendell, who form the organization called Pale Blue Dot. We are in this together in our, as we've established together in truth, with our tagline of justice doing through truth telling. So I'm going to run through a little bit just to get a bit of a grounding about the US child protection system. And we'll start here just thinking about kind of the orthodoxy that exists and the outcomes that our system unfortunately is creating or as a result of the orthodoxy. Okay. If you are an African-American child in the United States of America, you have a 1 in 2 chance of having a child abuse investigation in your childhood. If you're a white child in America, it's about 37 or 38% chance of having a child abuse investigation in your childhood. Child abuse investigations are traumatic events, and they're not some innocuous intervention. They oftentimes children are pulled out of their class in school, so their mates know, that that their family might be involved in child protection. They oftentimes are strip searched. Their homes are, every crevice and corner of their home is looked at. Their cupboards are opened, underneath the bed, underneath the rugs, photos are taken. It's an intrusive intervention. And I think we sometimes lose sight of that. So some other system of inequities, right? 14% of our population in the United States is African American, but 23% of the children are in foster care. 30.4% of youth in foster care identify as LGBTQ, and we know that they suffer more harassment in care. And if you're an Indigenous person in the United States, our Native Americans are 4 times more likely to be placed in foster care. So of these children and youth in foster care, again, just as kind of some grounding foundational data, and I do have a reference list at the end so you can see where all these references are coming from. We know that 90% of the children and youth are exposed to trauma, 70 to 80% exhibit moderate to severe mental health problems, 40 to 60% diagnosed with at least one psychiatric disorder, 40% run away from care. Where do they run? They try to run home. They try to find where they belong, back to their community, their culture. And often, and 25% experience 2 or more placements, which we know is very disruptive to any type of a semblance of normalcy. And there's plenty of studies that show that if you're a child or youth in foster care, you're going to be prescribed the rate of psychotropic medications compared to other children at 2 to 3 times. So there are and we have 36,500 kids in juvenile detention, correctional, and residential facilities. There's certainly a push in our nation to decrease that significantly through a range of different preventative efforts. So we know that the portrait for these young children and young people is not terribly good. We wouldn't want that for our own children. And so what does that result in, right? That results in significant impacts on people's physical health and well-being. So not just when they're in care, but then when they leave care, right? So this notion that adults who lived in foster care and residential care during childhood had a 40% chance of very poor health outcomes 10 years later, that increases to 85% chance in 2 decades. And we know that these children and young people are just exposed to an enormous amount of stress, including abuse and neglect, and that results in the risk for developing a range of different illnesses, right? Cancer rates increase, heart disease, lung and liver disease, et cetera. So these health impacts really span people's lifespan and result in quite a bit of premature death. These are, as we like to say, unfortunately, diseases of despair. So as we think about what these systems are creating, people who are much smarter than me said, we remove children from their families, and some advocates would say we forcibly separate children from their families. And we place them in a care system because we believe that we're going to be successful in having them adopted. But really what the system is producing is 23,000 legal orphans a year, right? Because 23,000 children in the United States age out every year out of care with no sense of belonging, no permanency, no relationships, et cetera. 70% become pregnant. 60% of them have a criminal conviction, 50% drop out, and 20% experience immediate homelessness. And so these outcomes, I think, are really because the system is creating disconnection and social isolation. We've basically eviscerated their family systems. They lose their cultural identity, experience quite a bit of trauma, and just don't feel like they belong. They have become those that we have othered in society. So if these are the outcomes, right, how does this myth of benevolence prevail as the dominant narrative in our child welfare and social care systems? I mean, juxtapose on the left-hand side the words that our system architects, and myself included, and others have used to describe the system, right, versus... Right, so we say we're very strengths-oriented, we're solution-focused, very relational, relationship-based, participatory, culturally responsive, trauma-informed, and in the UK, it's certainly from my travels in the last 9 days, a notion of being working very restoratively with families and in communities. But you have to juxtapose that against those who experience the system. And it's not that some families and some children have experienced those values and good quality social work, right? And see the system as something that's been very helpful in their lives. But when you look predominantly at what the activists are saying and the advocates and the qualitative literature at the complaint system, if we even look at the complaints that come into our system, what do they say? They say they feel punished. They feel a sense of oppression. They feel surveilled but not helped. That a sense of judgment, that their families are separated, that they experience a lot of fear and confusion. Our language is very complicated. Our court systems are very difficult to maneuver. And ultimately, in the United States, if you have a report of child abuse and neglect and it is substantiated to be the case, and you find yourself on a registry, which is, do you have registries? And yes, okay. You find yourself on a registry, and we create this system of long-term economic hardship. In fact, what we've now started to think about when we terminate parental rights and people get onto the registry, we call it the economic death penalty. Because in the United States and some states, you could be on that registry for whether you neglected a child because you didn't have enough food for them, or you sexually harmed a child. And there's probably some, as another type of reason that you could get on the registry, but you're both on the registry for the same amount of time and you have the same consequences. And in some states, that means you'll be on there for 30 years and there are certain types of employment that you cannot secure. So we've basically created an almost an impossible situation for people to be in the to economically care for themselves and their families. So when we think about the structures of oppression, myself and my colleagues have written a little bit on this, but I really want to point to Val Braithwaite out of Australia, who said, oppression has found a very hospitable environment in child welfare. And she said, but at the same time, she says, I want to encourage us to think that, to uncouple that criticism of the system, right, how the system operates, from the individual system actors. And I think that's important for our truth-telling work as we go forward. And then Joan Pennell, who said, right, most of us get into this work because we want to make our communities better. But we get stymied because the work contexts oftentimes reinforce racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression. So like many, I've dedicated my life to this societal dilemma, right? Child abuse and neglect, the welfare state, social care. But after 30 plus years, as I've watched innovations that challenge the orthodoxy dissipate and give way to technical solutions that minimize relationships, that entrench the bureaucracy, that create additional separation between professionals and the people who live on the edges of society, as I've witnessed that quality research to be ignored, even when it has been well translated to audiences of practitioners, policy and lawmakers, and as I have seen laws and policies that target those on the margins, particularly those who are Black, Brown, and Indigenous, I have come to the conclusion, along with my colleagues, Kevin and Liz, that we are not going to see change in our lifetimes without truth-telling. So let's just go look a little bit about the contemporary relevance of truth-telling. There are 3 examples, and many of them probably will look very familiar to you because they have international exposure. But historically and kind of in contemporary times, we do see examples of truth-telling as a way to acknowledge harms, to change harmful practices, and to create opportunity for healing, and in some cases, reconciliation. I mean, certainly the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa is one that is well known, certainly criticized by some as whether or not it repaired harms in a sufficient way. But the idea in 1995 was to help heal the country, right, and bring a reconciliation to its people by uncovering the truth about human rights violations that occurred during apartheid. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was established as part of a class action settlement around the Indian residential school settlement to facilitate reconciliation for witnesses who are directly and indirectly impacted by the residential schooling programs in Canada. The Pope was there in 2022 to apologize for the abuse experienced in government schools run by the Catholic Church. And most recently in the United States, we have Deb Haaglund, who is our U.S. Secretary for Interior. And she and others within that government agency established the U.S. Federal Boarding School Initiative. It really came out of the 2005 report out of Canada, where they noted that the residential schools were cultural genocide. And they found those unmarked graves of hundreds of children in boarding school properties. And so as those efforts were happening in Canada, we started to look inwardly as well, because we have an ugly history with boarding schools too. And she has gone around the country to bear witness to the harms that the boarding schools and the intergenerational impact of those boarding schools in communities and in tribal nations. So then you could say, well, why? Why are we doing this now? The stories, the outcomes are bleak. They tell a very bleak story. And ultimately, this type of system is really unbecoming of our nation. We are the United States of America, and we talk about our children being foundationally important, about the family as the most important construct, societal construct, and our rhetoric of what we say we believe about children and families doesn't appear to be showing up in policy. And lastly, we also have a workforce that is crumbling. And for quite a bit of time now, we've had parents and young people and grandparents and advocates who have been telling their stories for decades. They present at conferences, they're on advisory committees locally and nationally, and many of their refrains have remained very similar and consistent. And so what we really believe is that when truth is witnessed and post-traumatic wisdom is shared, we have the opportunity for healing, and that those who are most impacted can create solutions that result in better outcomes. And also action agendas and social political movements are built which can change laws, public rules, and public opinions. So the question is, why now? So you'll all remember where you were in March of 2020 when COVID shut down the world. Many of us, myself, I was in a privileged position of getting to go home into my basement and think about what am I going to do and what can I do? And, you're in the survival mode, I suppose. And it gave us a chance to really think, is the work that I'm doing, is it rooted in the principles that I believe in? Does it mesh with my values? So there's like a little bit of a hunger for change. And then the other thing that happened right early on in COVID is that George Floyd was murdered in the United States at the hands of police. And when nobody had anywhere to go, and that was cycling through your television and your social media news feed, that also created this kind of national reckoning on race. And that's really spilled into many other sectors and government services. And I think that incident, as well as a few other things, spilled over for us to take stock of the work that we were doing. And we've seen a kind of a hunger for transformative change in child welfare. Then the question is, why Kempe, right? We are credited as the birthplace of the child protection movement in the United States. And I think some of Dr. Kempe's work has spilled over internationally as well. We think we're an academic entity that's courageous enough to challenge our own work in the space and also help others to do the same. We at the Kempe Center and at Pale Blue Dot is that to see change in our lifetime, we're tired of incrementalism, right? We can't really continue to tinker anymore. The lives of millions of children and families require us to do better because we do know better. So that led us to conceptualizing truth-telling. And so what you'll see in the center circle is this notion of a catalyst. That is what Kevin, Liz, and I see ourselves only as. We're the catalyst for truth-telling. And what we did as our starting place is we brought together 5 very oppositional groups intentionally, because if you were going to do truth-telling in community, you will have all of these people in your circles. Right. So there are people who are very child safety oriented, really fear that if we don't do X, Y, or Z, another child will die. The system has to kind of stay the same and chug along. We have people who are reformists, right? So those are folks who if we adjust this policy or implement this new practice, we're going to make significant change. We have institutionalists around the table. They were most concerned really about their institutional legacy and protecting kind of their part of the industry, so to speak. We had transformers, right? People who said, yeah, you can't tinker, you can't reform. We have to make large scale change, whether it be through research, practice, and policy. And then we had a core group of abolitionists who want to have it all go away and stand up something else in its place. And so we brought them together to think through what could truth-telling look like. I will say, and I know this is being recorded, it was the hardest process I have ever been a part of in my professional career. I learned a lot. I was held accountable frequently. And the people that came into the space, while they couldn't even agree on what the conflict was that we were trying to resolve and what we were trying to create, they were very generous with their time. And for that, we're deeply grateful. What it came to is this notion of that we would have 4 different types of truth-telling circles. We would have circles for young people, children, young people and their families who are impacted, right? With this notion that if they give testimony, not if they tell their stories, they give testimony. Testimony has a different legitimacy to their experiences, and others have the opportunity to bear witness, just to listen, to take it in, not to deflect, not to try to respond immediately, just hold it in your heart, right? And that there's this opportunity for healing and a wholeness that would occur. We then moved on to thinking, well, maybe and this actually came from our family leaders and our activists. They said, we've been telling the truth for a very long time. Who needs to start telling the truth are the people who work in the system. So that led us to this notion of having circles for multi-system kind of professionals and volunteers. Because when you talk to people who work in the system, oftentimes they privately know it's not working. They actually privately know that they're asked to do things that go against their moral compass and their ethos, but they continue to operate in ways that align with what the system tells them to do. So we go from privately knowing, and in groups we can collectively name that. To us, that's liberating. That creates opportunity for people that are in these spaces to really envision something very differently. Not only differently for the children and families who they're working with, but also the children but also themselves and how they are in relationship in the work that they do. The third is around organizations, right? So how can organizations be accountable for their histories and be willing to interrogate what their histories has both created in the positive as well as perhaps not so positive. And there are a couple of examples of where this is happening. I'll just say, like I'm going to talk about the Kempe Center and some of my thinking around where we're headed in this conversation and what we're doing. But in addition, the American Bar Association, which is an association of one of the most preeminent legal associations that deals with children, deals with a range of legal issues, but like the group that we work with is around children, families, and the law. they started interrogating some of the legislation that they helped put into place in 1997. So it's the Adoption and Safe Families Act, and wrote a very compelling paper about their role in it. And basically said that they're going to dedicate the next number of years to getting that law repealed, because they realize that it has disproportionately harmed Black, Brown, and Indigenous families, and has created a family separation crisis in the United States. So, right, accountability for some things that you thought you were doing back 25 years ago, and now you've had the opportunity to see the impacts of the policies or the laws and want to take a different stand. And then lastly is the fourth group is our collective community group. So any impacted person, any person from the community who cares about these types of issues, come into human encounter with one another and work to create change. So our idea is like, we want to name the truth. We want to be in human encounter with one another. We want to break those codes of silence that oftentimes immobilize us. And we all want to lead to this, which leads to this public reckoning with actionable agendas. One of our other very core principles is that truth-telling without action is just another form of abuse. And so we really need, and it's not that it can't be cathartic or helpful for people to give their testimony, but what we're really trying to do is spur very large-scale change. So let me tell you a little bit about 3 circles that happened in the United States while our national group was thinking with us about what truth-telling would look like. Other funding was secured to support local communities in designing their own circles, and having it happen simultaneously was actually really super helpful to us. So our first city is Louisville, Kentucky. That's a city in kind of the southeastern part of our country. Muhammad Ali, our boxer, comes from there. It's a community that is really rooted and has a lot of social justice activities and emphases. And it also has a disproportionate number of African-American young people in care. 5 young people were recruited by a nonprofit with a blank palette. I mean, it was total blank slate. We want to do some truth-telling circles. You get to design what it looks like, and we're just going to kind of support you as you do that. And they really embedded a lot of restorative principles into their work. And they decided they wanted to give their testimony through art. And so, and they curated who was privileged enough to come into the space to hear what they had to say. And there was a broad set of stakeholders, and they've continued over the last 2 years to really think about, from their truth-telling circles, what type of advocacy agenda they wanted to put forward. But here, as I was privileged enough to sit in that circle twice, and their testimony was brilliant and very compelling. And there was a lot of similarities in what we heard, and it kind of went like this. My mama was poor. My mama loved us, and she still instilled good values in us. But because we were poor, child protection came to our home. That solution for child protection was just to remove us, and we went into foster care, and that's where I experienced abuse. And I moved around a bunch of times. It didn't have really much stability, but I figured out I was a commodity to the system. And if I was going to be used by the system, I was going to use the system too. So all these young people are quite well achieved, right? They, in the United States, if you experience foster care, you have a 3% chance of graduating from college. These were in that 3%, 3 MSWs and 1 lawyer. But their stories were so identical, and they didn't even know each other, right? But they built community with one another as they did this kind of 9-month process of designing these circles. We had parents in Washington, D.C. Through another neighborhood collaborative, who came together in community. Some had open child protection cases, some had closed, but they really they never felt like they had a voice to tell people what their experiences were with child protection. And so they've actually given briefings to city council. They were hoping that Netflix would pick them up for a documentary, not to be, but we did capture their voices through video and their perspectives through video. Again, wanting to think about that action and advocacy agenda from what they could cull from their testimony. And the last is our last community was in Nambe Pueblo, New Mexico. So New Mexico is a geographically large state on the kind of like between Texas and California, right on our southern border. It was led by tribal staff and elders, and they were really oriented towards healing their professionals, because what they realized in their community is that so many of the people that were working in this child welfare social care space in the community, that they had significant amounts of intergenerational trauma that had been caused by the system, because so many of their family members had been negatively impacted and actually removed from their family system and their tribal community. All right, so remember I told you that our national group that came together, and we had thought we would develop a framework for truth telling, and then realized that was a little colonizing, not really the best idea. But what that resulted in instead was really thinking about creating space for community to put their own imprint, to embed their own values, their own guiding principles into their truth-telling circles. And so what the team did was they really started thinking through, well, what are the values and how would those be expressed in a truth-telling circle? And these are just a sample. There are some others as well, right? Authenticity, compassion. We need to stay in a place of curiosity, being generous with our, not only with our time, but of our spirit and minds, being humble, recognizing that we know very little oftentimes, and just this notion of time, right? Oftentimes we move at a very quick pace and speed, and time, there's no confines to time when you do truth telling. You have to be willing to sit in space with one another for as long as it takes. And then some side guiding principles, right? These are, again, just a few: belonging, collectivism. Really wanted to focus in on justice doing. Lateral violence was a really important principle that came up because, and what that means is that instead of kind of targeting kind of your unhappiness, for the lack of a better word, around the system and how it operates, what we oftentimes see is this lateral violence of professionals targeting one another. And then meta conflict. Again, we couldn't even really decide on what the conflict was, but it's important just to think about that again as a guiding principle. And there are many others as well that are on our website. And let me just talk a little bit about what I think is different. So what's different in this process versus, remember I kind of gave you the 3 examples of government truth-telling commissions. What's different is that we put community in the center. And the leadership is different because it also has to come, from the community. When governments organize truth-telling, truth and reconciliation processes, there's often quite a bit of control that's in those efforts, right? The government decides who gives testimony. They probably review that testimony sometimes in advance. And we see these truth-telling circles as being far more organic and allowing, maybe allowing isn't the right word, but just free, a better freedom of expression. And we don't want to limit who gets to give testimony. Oftentimes, I think in the United States, what we see is that we have the same young people who have left care and many parent advocates who are just brilliant and in the work that they do, and we go back to the same people. We don't we don't get the truth from the young person who's living under the bridge or the young person who's in prison. We get the truth. We get our truth from the young person who has been successful. And so what we want to do is create space for all different types of perspectives. We think also what's different here is that if we can get to actionable responses, we see our ability to get to more rapid change cycles much more quickly, because these commissions oftentimes can take 3, 5, 10, 15 years. And so we want to see more rapid change. Again, we're looking at a broader definition of those impacted, both organizationally and professionals who are also impacted. And we also think, as well as those who have been impacted by the systems. And then we think there's going to be this witnessing contagion, that when you bring people in to listen very deeply and differently, that there's an opportunity for change. I'm just going to close on a little bit around organizational truth-telling and where we're headed. And we're doing some work at the Kempe Center related to that, both with our faculty and staff, creating truth-telling circles for them to really reflect on their practice with children and families and in communities, to be able to name harms that they feel like they perhaps have perpetuated and caused, as well as the good work that they've done too. But first, I think it's important that we have like a 4-goal step, or four goals that we're trying to achieve. We really want to bear witness to and be influenced and absorb the testimony of parents, youth, families, advocates, and scholars. We want to reduce our footprint of oppression by holding ourselves accountable to new ways of being and doing. We want to acknowledge our center's contribution, as well as any complicity and missteps that may have caused harm. And we want to repair the harm through actionable responses. And I intentionally picked that image around speak truth, even if your voice shakes, because it is a new uncharted path for us to think, both me individually and then as our center as well. So let's just quickly look at our modern beginnings, right? You probably know of the battered child syndrome paper that was written in 1962 by Dr. C. Henry Kempe and 4 of his colleagues, which really created a definition for this battered child syndrome based on X number of 100 children who were reported to emergency rooms with very serious conditions, physical abuse, etc. And it got defined as those who received that serious physical abuse, and is often a frequent cause of permanent injury or death. And that would have been, that definition in and of itself is fine. And then where the struggle, I think, comes in as we start to interrogate that paper a little bit differently is this notion of children that exhibit evidence of possible trauma or neglect and how that got defined, or when there's a marked discrepancy between the clinical findings and the historical data supplied by the parents. All of a sudden, now that those kind of conditions getting put into the definition of this battered child syndrome paper is a little bit perhaps problematic and set us on a course that still exists today. So how do we break the codes of silence? Well, we have to break the codes of silence through naming. And so these are I just want to be very clear. I am not representing other faculty and staff at the Kempe Center with these comments, but this represents my own thinking. So did the conclusions of the battered child syndrome lead to these things? The over-medicalization of child abuse and neglect, the pathologizing parents and caregivers. For example, when you look at the conclusions in the battered child syndrome paper, it talks about parents, any person that could have potentially have harmed a child, as a psychopath, as a sociopath, as somebody of lower intelligence, and many other derogatory kind of classifications. Did that get into the groundwater? Did that get into our training? Back in the early or mid 60s to early 70s. Remember, back in those days, there were not that many papers that had been written yet. There wasn't the internet. There weren't a lot of books. Much of this was in print media, and so that's something we just have to think about. I think this is, in my opinion, one of the first places where the conflation of abuse and neglect happened in that paper. And then I think the other thing that was just missing was that they centered child maltreatment as an individual problem rather than a societal deficiency. So what were the solutions? So part of it is that the solutions kind of emanated from not only the Kempe Center, but many other centers in the United States. And some came directly from this paper from 1962 to 1974. And there are 4 that I just named here. There's some others. I just decided to stick with 4. But one is this notion of mandated reporting, right? Where professionals and all sorts of different classifications are required to report if they have any concern around a child's well-being, if they're fear that they've been harmed. And there's really no evidence to date that this policy has been studied to show that it makes much of a difference. But our center was instrumental between 1962 and 1974. And every state in the union established mandated reporting laws before they were even required to do so by our federal law. And what people say is that this policy actually discourages people from accessing help. So that's one. I would point people to Dr. Merkel-Roz's work in this area. The next is the 1974 Act, our Child Abuse and Prevention and Treatment Act, where the emphasis on working with families was through investigating them, prosecuting them, and treating them. And what it has resulted in is just that it's resulted in a state of surveillance and not help. And somebody who has been sexually harmed and somebody who needs a coat or is living in inadequate housing does not need the same response. Please investigate the child who's been sexually harmed, and please assess and provide help to the other family. And what we now see is this treatment is that treatment is going to be delivered through evidence-based practices, many which were never designed to work with child welfare populations. But nonetheless, this is kind of the direction that we are headed in the United States. We don't really, excuse me, we don't really look at things through a rights lens. We look at things through an evidence-based practice lens. So what were the other solutions that kind of emanated, right? We along with many others promoted this notion of stranger care. Some people call it foster care. Our New Zealand colleagues said, it's really stranger care. And so what we know now is that removing children from their families is a really traumatic event. And there's increasing evidence around the PTSD that ensues from that. So when we limit people from and eliminate contact from everything that they know, they love, they trust, that's actually more damaging than the event that precipitated the removal. So we have to be open, right? To be open to new perspectives of what the evidence is showing us. And then lastly, one of the earliest solutions that came out of the Kempe Center is this notion of a multidisciplinary team, MDTs, right? Lots of different professionals come together to think through what the plan and course of action should be. But could we suspend that and just think that best outcomes actually occur in collaborative planning processes in an environment when families lead? MDTs oftentimes don't include families. And so I go back to the mantra that when we know better, we do better, and we cannot bury the evidence that has been generated in these last 50 years and stay with the same system that we have today. And here's my hero. So I just thought I'd end with what he has to say, right? If we find the courage to tell the truth, something good will happen. Something is waiting for us that feels more like freedom or equality or justice. But to get there, we have to do the hard work. And so we're ready to do the hard work, and we hope many others will join us on that journey as well. And I thank you for the opportunity to be here with you.
So Lisa, we've got some questions for you. And firstly, thank you for such a fantastic sort of exploration of this journey. Honestly, it's uplifting and really interesting and really exciting. So I'm just going to hit straight to the questions, really. They kind of centre around a couple of areas. One is, I think I'll start with this one first. You know, if we talk about the hand that government and governments have had in truth-telling, you know, how are you achieving that community at the centre? How are you actually achieving that?
So I don't think we know yet. This is quite aspirational. We're looking for communities to join us in the journey. It always takes a few groups to like be the cliff jumpers, right? And to see some value in doing it. I think, especially in local authorities, they're very suspect of this. They think that we're being hypercritical of child welfare or the local authorities in the system. And that by creating space for their workforce to take part in these types of conversations that will just drive people away. I actually think the opposite. I think it'll be liberating for people. Right now we have these massive vacancy rates in the United States. We can't recruit people in and we can't keep them in the positions. And I think it's because this generation of young people who are, you know, coming in to this work, their values do not mesh with the values that they are seeing operationalized in systems of how we treat families. So they leave. They'd rather do something less stressful. And it's not about pay, but less stressful and perhaps less harmful. And so we literally are just on the cusp of trying to find our incubator sites. And I will say one other thing, like it's hard, in addition, it's a little difficult to find funding from our kind of foundation or philanthropic sector because there's a fear of liability for once people start telling the truth.
Thank you, Lisa. That's I think we can sort of echo some of that insight into the workforce and the crisis recruitment, and particularly in social work. I think many social workers would reflect on that insight. I suppose in a sense you've kind of shared it a bit, but one of our questions was, you know, what's been the response from that wider system? You shared a bit of that was where you've got the resistance, but where have you got the welcome?
I think the resistance, it's very scary to reflect on, especially for many people who, and leaders in particular, and managers and supervisors who have been at the heart of how these systems, you know, within these systems for so many years. Their whole professional career has been in these local authorities or counties or a state government. And it's hard to stop and reflect about whether some of the work that the system has done has actually caused harm. Even just that question alone can be terrifying for people. And I think so we have to approach it with caution and care. And what I think where we're starting to get some momentum is when people start thinking about the work of the child welfare system from a social and racial justice lens. There's an opening for people to think about their work differently and how they've perhaps contributed, and perhaps how they could attend to those issues a little bit differently in the work that they do. Thanks
so much. Yes. Leading on, direct question really about the story you told around the American Bar Association. You know, what led them to engage with the process? I mean, they were doing their own kind of truth-telling process that's a little bit outside of our work, but we've now kind of found one another, right? It was their director who started
digging into some of the policies from the 1950s. A great deal of concern by legal scholars in our country around the parents who really have gone unfairly not represented. We've had quite a bit of legal representation for children, high quality representation for children, both lawyers and volunteers, et cetera. Less so for parents, parent representation. And there have been, I think this is kind of the interesting phenomenon in the United States. When I think about the people who are calling for either transformative change or for abolition, it's not coming from our social work community. It's coming from our legal community. It's our attorneys who really are standing up in the space of racial and social justice. It's the American Civil Liberties Union who are recognizing that the system operates in ways that actually break a number of the constitutional amendments and fair protections for people. And so you have these large, legal, powerful, I would say powerful groups and well-recognized in society who are starting to interrogate the system that the social workers have been running for years. And they're not being kind, and they are being very aggressive in both their study of it, their advocacy for children and families and communities, and they've been standing up some models that are very effective in reducing children coming into care.
Yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to talk to people from like Bronx Defenders and obviously Dorothy Roberts, who are coming from that legal scholarship world, academic world. It's really interesting to see the analysis coming from that space and not from the social care sort of academia. It's really interesting. So we're going to stay positive on the circles. So like this truth telling process. One of the questions we've got here is. How you described bringing together a group of people that you wouldn't get into a room normally on a good day.
Right.
And so managing those forces is something I'm interested in, how you manage the forces that are in that room. But how do we ensure that, that sort of multiple perspective is maintained and somebody isn't a domineering or a dominant and captures the space and pushes through and, creates something framed rather than unframed in what you're trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, and I think we don't. It's an interesting question.
It comes from the person who's got the big thinking in the room.
It's kind of, I almost liken it to a family group conference in the sense of you have to think of it as a process and not as a one-time event. And the reason I think nobody's perspective was domineering or dominant in these circles is that they happened over time regularly. So I think that was, and two things can be true. I mean, we had some young people in Louisville who felt indebted to the system. I mean, the system saved their life, even though they felt harmed as well, right? And other young people did not share that perspective. But we really tried to lay out some restorative guidelines for how we were going to work with one another in group in a way that was both liberating for those who were giving testimony, but respectful of the words and their perspectives that were coming forth. So I think it's a few things that were fairly instrumental in that. And just like kind of some of the values of respect and mutuality and the witnessing, I think, is so important because oftentimes we listen, but we don't deeply listen. We listen because we want to respond. And so we really encouraged people there was no opportunity to ask questions. There was no opportunity to delve deeper and tell me about that experience or why do you think that happened? That was not part of the circle. It really was people controlling their narrative
Thank you. So I think that goes close to a question that I've been asked, which is around in a sense, what happens in a circle so you don't end up in a position where people don't speak because they feel they have to defend or protect themselves. But what you're saying is, we didn't have that kind of challenge.
We didn't.
Not allowing that challenge in that circle.
No, and
listening circle.
And the other, I've seen some other people doing restorative circles or these kind of truth-telling circles online. Not sure it's the most effective mechanism, but I certainly in today's times, I think we're going to have to figure out how to make that happen. But there's always the opportunity to, professionals who are thinking about their practice and, thinking about some of the harms that they perhaps have caused as they reflect back and wish that they had done things a bit differently. And what we saw in these professional circles is, just kind of time allotments for people to give their testimony. And if you don't want to speak, you can pass. That's the other thing too.
I know we're coming to the close of our wonderful talk with you and these questions. I suppose the last thing I wanted to talk to you a little bit about was I love that movement to actional change. And do you know how you get there yet through the truth telling? Have you got a sense of how you get there?
We don't have a total sense of how we're going to get there yet. But what I'll say is that I think that's what the beauty has been like in our Louisville project has really taken the time to over, 9 to 18 months at time, I suppose, to have multiple circles, to really coalesce around an agenda, to have the young people kind of driving what they think the policy change should be, and then working with other professional advocates to introduce change at the State House level. Will it be transformative? Probably not in this case, but it was kind of the first go of watching young people really coalesce around an agenda. And I mean, it won't be transformational. I do think it'll happen because they're very clear that they're not going to go away quietly. So yeah, I think that's the question. I mean, we've got ideas around how we could gather information from these truth-telling circles once we can launch them in more communities. But that is definitely our focus and our interest.
That's wonderful. Lisa, can I just take this moment just to thank you so much for, I know you've been travelling all around the UK, so I was so delighted that you could come and speak to us at the NAFL today, and I'm sure everybody who's going to get a chance to see the recording are going to really enjoy it. I think I'm going to conclude by saying something I think we've picked up at the NAFL Family Justice Observatory, and we've been trying to do our encountering with those impacted, and those are the professionals, the practitioners, the judiciary, as well as our families. And I think my colleagues will agree with me that time becomes a big part of this. They always refer to time for things to happen, time for change to happen, or time to do the work better. The pressures in the system really squeeze time. So the idea that we're creating a space where and understand that time is just a commodity to be harnessed and really developed. It really resonates with me. Yeah. So can I thank you so much? It's been a delight to see you in the flesh.
I know.
And
you're real.
You're real, and you're real, and I knew you were for real and lovely, and I know that you are the biggest change maker I know in my life. So it's just amazing. So can I just ask people to just thank Lisa for us again?
Oh, thank you.